Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the July Museum After Hours. Wow, what a full house we have tonight. Okay. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, good deal. Well, welcome to the July Museum After Hours. We're happy to have you with us tonight. As you know, our speaker was scheduled to be here in January, but just a small blizzard kind of kept everybody away. So we're really happy to have him back here tonight. He's also doing a book signing after his talk, and the book is on sale for $20. It's a book we also carry in our store, even when he's not speaking. So please, if you're interested, please join him afterwards. A couple other announcements is on Sunday, July 28th, the curators here with not only the museum, but in the state archives, as well as archaeology, will be offering a behind-the-scenes tour. It is fantastic to see. And if you're a member of the Historical Society, you get in, the admissions is $4, non-members is $15. But it lasts about an hour and a half, and it's well worth seeing. I tell you what, there's nothing like seeing a dress that Carrie Nation wore, or there's nothing like seeing where the Constitution for the state of Kansas is kept, and those types of things. So it's pretty amazing. Toward the end of September, and September 27th and 28th, is going to be the 6th annual Taste of Kansas bus tour, and they're going to be in Leavenworth this year and Atchison. This is the 170th year that Abraham Lincoln came to Kansas to announce his presidential election here in the state. So lots of things to look forward to, and again, if you're a member of the society, you do get a discounted fee for that bus tour. Thank you so much for all your donations and all of your memberships and everything that you do each month. We get asked a lot what the donations go to, and they go to so we can find quality speakers like we have month after month after month. So it's always greatly appreciated. With that, introduce Mary Madden, who's the Director of Education and the museum here, and she will introduce our speaker.
Thank you. Susan, you made all the announcements, so we hope to see you at the behind-the-scenes tour and the bus trip, limited seating. We can't add more seats to the bus like we can tonight. One of the things some of you know is that we are videotaping the presentation, so it can be on YouTube. I like to listen to speakers kind of in the dark, but I've been told I can't turn the lights off or you can't see anything. So we'll be just bright and sunny here like this. Our speaker is a familiar person to the Historical Society. He was actually one of our site curators down at Mine Creek a couple years ago.
It's been a while. It's
been a while. We have historic sites all over the state. And he was at Mine Creek, which is near Pleasanton. Near Fort Scott. Can you hear me? Is this working? Okay. What?
It's working. Just keep it in front of your...
I keep it in front of my mouth. It's getting lipstick on it as I speak. Okay. He's a native Kansan who worked in the history profession for over 15 years. At a variety of museums, university archives, and historic sites. He currently works at the National Archives in Kansas City. This is his first book he'll be speaking on, Hidden History. But I just learned you have a second book coming out, Wicked History. Will any of you be in it? No. Wicked History, which comes out in November. Okay. So he will be speaking tonight on the Kansas's storied past is filled with fascinating firsts, humorous coincidence, and intriguing characters. And without any further comments, I'd like to have you welcome with me our speaker, Adrian Zink. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. All right, can everyone hear me okay? All right, I am blown away by the crowd here tonight. I really appreciate you guys all coming out. This is probably my biggest crowd I've spoken to across the state. I've done about 30 of these talks. And what I really want to impart to the crowd is my enthusiasm for history. There's not a lot of things I get very excited about, and I want to share my passion with you guys. And through this, I hope that you take it home with you and it maybe revives some of your passion. And I think I'm speaking to the choir here because you guys are here on a Friday night. So I don't think I need to inspire you guys too much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background and who I am. And then I will tell you how I came up with the idea for this book and what hidden history means to me and how you can find it yourself. So just like a lot of things in life, we don't always know where our interests necessarily exactly came from. You know, like you might know that you always liked painting, or maybe you liked woodworking because your grandfather took you into his shop when you were a kid, or something like that. I can date my love of history to an exact moment, which is kind of interesting. So I was just a regular kid growing up, playing video games and watching The Simpsons and doing whatever, being a kid, riding my bike. And I got interested in history a specific day at age 14 at my high school in Larned, Kansas. How many Larnedites we have here besides my father? All right, just my dad. So anyway, so I'm from Larned, Kansas. And I had a great history teacher named Rod Bauer in high school. And he made history fun. He said the problem with history is it's all dates and names sometimes with certain people that teach it. And this year this happened, and this year Henry VIII did this to this wife, he did this to that wife, blah, blah, blah. He said it's fun, it's active, it's alive. You need to get people excited by putting them there in the place, tell them the stories. So the very first day he passed around a small cannonball from the Civil War, maybe a little fist-sized cannonball. And we all got to hold it. And he said, do you guys realize back in the Civil War, it was linear formations? You had to walk in a line and just stay in your line and get shot at. And we were all 14, and we were like, whoa, I think I remember that from the movie Glory, duh. But he passed this thing around, and we all got to feel the weight. And he's like, can you imagine this thing flying at your face? Would you have the guts to just stand there and take it? And not break ranks, and we're all like, whoa, that got history right in our face because we got to actually hold it. How else are you going to get kids into it unless you let them actually experience a little bit? So we held this little cannonball, and he went back up to the podium. Then he threw it. Threw it right at us. I'm going to demonstrate what my row did. I'm going to need a chair. So my row did this. We all hit the deck. We all hit the deck because, sometimes it's fight or flight. So it was definitely flight. When you're laying on the ground and you're 14 and you see a iron ball bouncing, physicist, but the iron doesn't really bounce, right? Like that. And then you realize it was a racquetball he switched it with. It's like, okay, this guy's funny. I loved his class so much, I decided history's it. I'm doing it. That's my passion. I liked math, I liked science, I liked all that stuff, but history was what I wanted. So I went to KU, and I had the fortune to study abroad. And there's where I learned my love of archives. I work at the National Archives, and that's what led to my love of just random stories and cool facts, and led to me to write this book. Here's me when I had more hair. In Prague, touring Europe, following this guy around. I got to actually hold the Treaty of Schönbrunn, the one that Napoleon signed to make the Austrians accept his rule over pretty much all of continental Europe in 1809. It's really interesting to get to hold that stuff and see his signature on things. I went to Washington, D.C. I've had a great adventure working with history. At Washington, D.C., I worked at a place called the National Security Archive. And this is a place that works with declassified Cold War materials, like the Strategic Air Command Emergency Nuclear Warfare Checklist from September 1964, so we don't maybe have a nuclear war before we're actually ready, right? After the Cuban Missile Crisis. But working there, when you decide on history as a field, it's not always easy. Sometimes you do road construction, or you're a valet, or you're a security guard, which I've done to help pay the bills. But while I was there, I had a gentleman walk in one day that was like, he was a nice, well-dressed man, maybe about 80 years old. He said, I need to talk to your boss right now. And I said, well, he's in a meeting right now. Can I take a note real quick? He said, oh, he's going to want to talk to me. And I said, what's your name, sir? He said, Bob McNamara. And I was like, you mean JFK's Secretary of Defense, Bob McNamara? The guy that got us into Vietnam? So, yeah, I got to work with Bob McNamara for a while on some declassified documents. So that kept my interest alive, like working with some interesting people on things like that. I went to Marquette University after my years at KU, and I got to work with this guy's stuff. J.R.R. Tolkien, all his papers are there. I got to work with the original Hobbit materials, his notes. It's so fascinating. I was like, I love this, I want to be an archivist. I want to work with these materials. And, to pay the bills, sometimes I helped people with their family heraldry and their family history. And I had some fun adventures looking up my own. Maybe I have a cool family crest. Let me look it up. These guys have foxes and swords. No. I've got a guy in a raincoat holding blue flowers behind a low hill. I was like, this can't be right. So I had to do a little more research. No, here's multiple versions of the Zink family crest. Blue flowers, raincoat, and I was going to be him for Halloween last year, but I forgot. Anyway, so I've had an adventure. I've had a fun time working a lot of different places, working with a lot of different interesting materials, and it brought me back to Kansas. If you guys recognize the Sandy Thomas painting, it's of the Battle of Mine Creek. That's what drew me back to Kansas, working at Mine Creek Battlefield State Historic Site for the Kansas Historical Society. It was a great couple years teaching the Kansas Civil War history, and while I was there, that's where I got the idea for this book. I had so many people coming in that were such Civil War experts, I felt dumb. Honestly, I knew the Civil War pretty good, but I was an administrator, and I didn't know it all. Sometimes they'd be like, Adrian, where was the 2nd Colorado exactly 2 days before? And I was like, let me check my notes. So I did everything I can to read up on this and find everything I could about Kansas and the Civil War. And I kept coming across interesting facts. And I said, Adrian, you should write a book about this. Back in 2011, I was making notes to self. Oh, Adrian, by 2012, you should do this. I didn't do it in 2012. By 2013, you should do it. Had a daughter. 2014, Adrian, you should get on this. I got Netflix. And and then that killed me for 2 years. I was just watching Netflix. But 2016, I finally decided to put together my favorite stories that I compiled and throw it at a publisher called The History Press down in South Carolina. And they liked my ideas, and it came out in November 2017. I've been touring the state ever since and telling stories. So as you can tell, I'm a guy that loves lots of interesting things, and I did not have a hard time finding inspiration for this book. I'm going to tell you 4 stories tonight, and I'm going to tell you the way I came across these stories, it just comes across randomly. One of them I found through working with U.S. Patent Office files at the National Archives. Another story I found was through looking at a book about Legos. The truth. Another one I came across when there was a debate about the $10 bill, and another one was from a Sunday drive. So, I'm going to start off tonight. Oh yeah, this is what I do each day, National Archives. But I'm going to start off by talking about auto polo. Has anyone ever heard of this insane sport? So if you can't see it, it says auto polo or Mad Max for the country club set. I call it polo, but played with cars. What could possibly go wrong? The 1910s were an exciting time to be a vehicle enthusiast. Automobiles were quickly replacing the horse. Ford's Model T had just been released in 1908 and was well on its way to eventually selling 15 million units during its 19-year run. Motorcycle companies such as Indian and Harley-Davidson were selling their products all over the nation, causing Americans to fall in love with the motorcycle. Kansas was not immune to this trend. Many car and motorcycle events and races entertained the public during this decade, including a record-breaking 100-mile motorcycle race in Norton. The wildest use of automobiles at that time, and likely ever, is the game of automobile polo, or auto polo for short. Officially invented in 1911 by a Ford dealer in Topeka. Woo! Got my Topeka people in the house? Ford dealer right here named Ralph Hankinson. He came up with this game as a publicity stunt to sell cars. In this promotion, he promised a game of polo, but with cars instead of horses. What could go wrong, right? At the July 20th, 1912 event, 2 teams squared off against each other, 2 cars per team with 2 men inside each. In each car, the driver focused on getting to the ball and avoiding collisions while the mallet man hit the ball. The tops of the Model T cars and doors were removed for better visibility, and so the mallet man could stand and swing the mallet. You got this, guys? You got one driver, you got no roof, no doors, no helmets, seatbelts, and one fool hanging out the side with a mallet ready to hit the ball. It's exciting to me. Over 5,000 spectators came to a Wichita alfalfa field to witness this wild new spectacle. The concept for the sport had likely been around for a few years, but Hankinson gets credit for the first widely publicized games. From then on, the sport exploded into popularity nationwide. This was a national phenomenon, and we barely talk about it these days. Roughly the length of a football field and half again as wide, the game could be played both outdoors and indoors. This gave the game a year-round audience, and it became common nationwide at fairs, exhibitions, and even major arenas like Madison Square Garden. This is a Chicago auto polo team. Look at these guys. Here's an artist rendering. Pretty cool. Here's some guys going at it. And I want to show you, do you notice the little roll bar on the back behind their heads? That's how I found out about this sport. I'll explain it. Look at that. You think they might need a roll bar? Mr. Hankinson even patented the first roll bar on the back of the vehicle to prevent the players from being crushed. That's how I found out about it. Working at the National Archives with U.S. Patent Office files, we have the first roll bar patent. And reading up on this, I'm like, what was this? And finding out auto polo? What's this insane game? There's a lot of great old footage and photos of this thing. So Hankinson's sport became popular not only coast to coast, but internationally. It was described by many in the press as the lunatic game. I don't know why. Cars would constantly throw riders out of them, roll over, and repeatedly collide. Mostly, riders just had cuts and broken bones, but deaths, though they're rare, they did happen. Sponsored by Texaco, Hankinson traveled to the Philippines and the United Kingdom to promote the sport and recruit new teams. Teams from Wichita even toured Europe in 1913 to much fanfare. The game chugged on into the late 1920s, but the high cost of repairing and replacing the cars eventually did end the sport. The public had other avenues for entertainment now as well, with the rise of basketball, football, and the cinema. The cinema was a big one. Kind of like Netflix killed off my ambitions to be a writer. The cinema kind of helped kill off auto polo. Fewer auto polo promoters were willing to cough up the money for something so expensive as well. Hankinson's teams in 1924 alone reported 538 burst tires, 66 broken axles, 1,564 broken wheels, 10 cracked engines, and 6 cars that were just so totally destroyed they had to be permanently retired. After World War II, the game made a small comeback in the Midwest, but then it faded again forever. So the next time you see a demolition derby, a NASCAR race, or monster trucks, just keep in mind that's child's play compared to auto polo people. Modern people tend to look at the past as stuffy and uptight, but this game shows that the opposite is true. You couldn't get an insurer to back this today. I know this personally because in my years working as a historian archivist, I actually took a couple years as an insurance agent just to pay the bills, feed the kids. And I worked specifically with amusements and auto insurance. We would not touch this. Sprint Center would not allow this. We don't like insuring things where people are likely to die. So the old days were often much more fun than today. And that is auto polo. A little bit later, I can pull up, I can actually do that now. I can pull up a little video of an auto polo event from Minnesota. It is on YouTube. It is a silent film. Let's do it. It's not, there's ragtime music over this, but whatever. Like, there's no actual audio with this. So, rip snorting auto polo cars arrive in Hibbing today. Hooray. The Benzene Wagons. So, August 15th, 1915. And you can get a good sense of what this looked like. A lot of photos of people playing auto polo are likely staged because the exposure time on the old cameras was so long. You're not going to get a snapshot of this. You got to be nimble, and you got to jump out at just the right time, by the way. That guy. Well done, sir. I really enjoy looking at this old footage. And look at that. Insanity. But can you imagine how exciting this was before there was, internet, TV, anything going on? I like the mallet up in the air. That one's pretty sweet. There's a couple I've seen that are very obviously fake because the car's tilted up, but you can see there's a pole or something holding it up in the back. A little auto polo for you guys. It's on YouTube if you want to see it. Auto polo in Hibbing, Minnesota. So, the next story that I'm going to tell. All right, we're back. Oh yeah, here's a couple teams going at it. This is about a guy named Boston Corbett. Does anyone know who this man is? Yell it out. Exactly, I'm talking to a crowd that loves history. Yep, the man who shot John Wilkes Booth. And for those of you that don't know his story, it's got a Kansas connection and it's great. And I came with the idea to write this one because of a Lego book. There is a book called Assassination, the Brick Chronicle of Attempts on the Lives of 12 U.S. Presidents. They recreate assassinations and assassination attempts with Lego characters. And it sounds tacky, and maybe it is. But it's actually quite interesting. He recreates a lot of interesting things from history with Legos, especially the one on Andrew Jackson where he beat the guy down with his cane after trying to shoot him. But I came across that, and I saw them mention Boston Corbett in the Lincoln assassination one. And I was like, oh, yeah, that guy. I remember seeing his dugout years ago. Has anyone ever been to Concordia and seen his dugout? I hear a couple yeses. Well, we're going to tell you Boston Corbett's story right now. When John Wilkes Booth assassinated President Abraham Lincoln on April 14, 1865, the largest manhunt in American history commenced. Over 10,000 federal troops and innumerable civilians assisted in the search for the assassin. Soldiers from the 16th New York Cavalry caught up with him on April 26th at the tobacco farm of Richard H. Garrett in Northern Virginia. After setting fire to the barn to flush him out, Sergeant Boston Corbett snuck up behind the barn and shot Booth in the back of the head through a crack in the barn. Booth was carried out of the burning barn, dying 2 hours later on Garrett's porch. So there's Mr. Corbett shooting through the barn at Booth, right there. When the nation learned of who killed Booth, Corbett was seen by many in the media and the public as a hero, though he directly disobeyed Secretary of War Edwin Stanton's orders to capture Booth alive. Capture Booth alive. He might be part of a conspiracy. He might have things to say. Turns out it was a conspiracy and there were many people involved in this. But Corbett didn't listen. And he was a hero, national hero now, people. You gotta think about this as they thought this guy was Lincoln's avenger. He got Booth. He shot him. A lot of people didn't care maybe about due process or finding out more. They're just glad somebody got him. But, this is a great story of careful who your heroes are. They might be a little interesting. Little did these people know what a character Mr. Corbett was. Born in London, Mr. Corbett immigrated to New York in 1839 and was apprenticed as a hatter during his youth. What do you guys know about 19th century hat makers? Mercury, right? Hatters of that era were exposed to dangerous amounts of mercury nitrate fumes when treating hat felt, which may have led to his later psychosis and hallucinations. Right? That's where the Mad Hatter comes from. It was a stereotype that hat makers were crazy. turns out they usually were because they were working with mercury. So I kind of have a soft spot for Mr. Corbett because he came by this honestly. This madness was something that was probably definitely tied to his profession. So Mr. Corbett's erratic behavior could definitely be tied to his work. A deeply religious man, he was known to randomly proselytize the people on the street and to scold coworkers who swore in his presence, followed by singing or praying for them. He barely kept his friendships, yelled at coworkers, had a very chaotic life. Once, even in 1858, he was so mortified by a pair of prostitutes propositioning him that he castrated himself with a pair of scissors to avoid temptation. I know this is a crowd pleaser. I know you want to hear that. But it's kind of important to tell, the frame of mind this guy was in. He was not of sound mind. And so I have to say that. I know it's a crowd pleaser. So yeah, he sought medical treatment later, only after having a meal and going to a prayer meeting. So that's before the Civil War. That's our hero. After the Civil War, though, he led a rambling, incoherent life, preaching around the country and being fired from numerous jobs after stopping work to pray or yell at coworkers. He would sometimes cash in on his fame as Lincoln's Avenger, but was never invited back to groups he spoke to due to his erratic behavior. You guys got to rewind your mind to the old days. I could have spoke at Polo this morning and caused a huge sensation and just gotten kicked out, and then spoken here today or later today, and you guys wouldn't have known. There's no mass media where, say Google, you could look up somebody's reputation. Every time he went to another town, he was he was Lincoln's Avenger. His reputation didn't really precede him. Increasingly paranoid that the government was out to get him for killing Booth, he began carrying a gun everywhere. He was even kicked out of an army reunion for pulling his gun out on men who questioned his account of Booth's death. He would also pull his gun out on anyone who looked at him funny. He didn't like that. It was in this frame of mind he came to Kansas, settling near Concordia in 1878. He built himself a dugout home in the ground and worked as a traveling preacher. His fame as Lincoln's Avenger often outran his reality as a mentally disturbed man. And by January of 1887, he had an old army friend that kind of felt sorry for him. He said, Mr. Corbett is living in a hole in the ground, struggling as a preacher with, lots of personal problems. I'm going to try to get this guy a job, So he went to talk to some people in high places, guys, do you know Lincoln's Avenger is kind of falling on hard times here in Kansas? So, can we get him a job, get him something respectable? Some people banded together to get him a job. Where did Mr. Corbett work? Oh, that's right. The State House, right here in Topeka. A couple of you knew that one. Yeah. He was offered the job of assistant doorkeeper at the Kansas House of Representatives in Topeka. Those trusting Kansans thought they'd hired themselves quite the national celebrity to protect the esteemed leaders of the state. Clearly, these people didn't realize what they were getting themselves into. Not too long after, on February 15th, there he is up on the balcony, pulling out his revolver and chasing other officers of the House from the building, convinced they were discriminating against him. After his arrest, a Topeka judge deemed him mentally unfit. Finally, get this guy some help. And he was placed in the Topeka Asylum for the Insane. But the next year, though, if you can read that, it says, insane man escaped. He made a classic getaway. He made a daring escape on horseback. Just walked off, took a horse, and rode into the sunset. It's kind of he told someone he was heading to Mexico. Kind of like a Shawshank Redemption ending, I hope. So that's the last record we have of his existence. We don't really know what happened to him. There is a man named Boston Corbett that shows up on the list of the dead from a fire in Minnesota in 1894, but we don't know if it's the same Boston Corbett. So I hope he got off to Mexico and enjoyed the rest of his life in whatever wild, problematic way it ended up. But Boston Corbett was definitely one of the most interesting characters of the whole Lincoln assassination story. And if you go out to Concordia, you can see his dugout. There's a little sign. It's quite cool. My next story is more inspiring. Miss Susanna Salter. A lot of people know her. And do Do you guys know what her main claim to fame is? Yep. She was the first woman to be mayor of a town anywhere in the United States. And she did it here in Kansas. And this is one of those stories, it's not terribly hidden. It'll appear in a Kansas history book, but they don't tell you what led to her becoming mayor. You don't always hear the background of it. You'll just see it in a list of interesting facts. And that's what bothers me about history sometimes. The way she became mayor is the story. I call this first woman elected mayor in the United States. It took decades for the women's suffrage movement to gain ultimate success in 1920, when women were finally granted the right to vote nationwide. Kansas was not immune to these movements and had its own local suffrage chapters. In 1877, women in Kansas had gained the right to vote in city municipal elections, and it didn't take long for their influence to be felt. There's some suffragettes in Leavenworth in the 1870s. Kansas was a very progressive state at that time, as a lot of you probably know. So, guys, keep in mind, city municipal elections, the ladies were not allowed to vote for statewide office, not governor, not senator, no national elections, no president, no congressman, but just city municipal elections. This is baby steps. So, Miss Susanna Medora Salter was a wife and mother of young children in Argonia, population 500. It's west of Wichita, little town, where she worked as an officer in the local Women's Christian Temperance Union. Some of the men in town thought it'd be funny to put her name on the Prohibition Party ticket, thinking she would lose. Little prank. They were incensed at the intrusion of female voters into their domain, but little did they realize she would actually win with 2/3 of the vote on April 4th, 1877. This election win came just weeks after women were enfranchised. Other local offices were won by women, showing the power of their vote. This is a letter from the outgoing mayor to her saying, Miss Salter, you have been elected mayor, report to duty, basically. So she was kind of like, okay, I wasn't planning on this. I got these kids to raise, but sure, why not? Okay. Though not expected to ever be mayor and not even originally seeking the office, Susanna performed her duties admirably. She was also no fool. She was only 6 weeks shy of graduating college at Kansas State Agricultural College, what we know now today as K-State, where she fell ill and had to drop out. She broke no nonsense during meetings, though, and was no novice to politics. Though she was just 27 years old, her father was the town's first mayor, and her father-in-law, Melville J. Salter, was once the lieutenant governor of Kansas. Her husband acted as city clerk as well, so she knew how things worked. She knew the functions of a city. Some of the men who put her up for the nomination were city council members themselves, and were surprised when she opened the first meeting by saying, "Gentlemen, what is your pleasure? You are the duly elected officials of this town. I am merely your presiding officer. Let's get to work." And they're like, okay, wow. This is a highly radical thing for this era. You guys got to understand. It was the 1870s. Women were in hoop skirts. They were expected to be the moral leaders of the family of society, to keep the violent, drunken men in line, to keep up the Christian values, to do the housekeeping, not as leaders in cities, businesses, things like that. Highly abnormal. This was an absolute sensation. So she served an uneventful year, got along with everyone great, but she became this international sensation and curiosity. She received congratulatory mail from all over America and also from many European nations. Newspapermen from the coasts came to Argonia to write about her. One New York reporter hopped a train, rode all the way out to Argonia, and met her, and he said, "I asked Mrs. Salter if her ambition to act as a female politician or leader in women's suffrage circles had been aroused by her election. She quickly replied, 'No. Indeed, I shall be very glad when my term of office expires, and shall only be too happy to therefore devote myself entirely, as I always have done before, to the care of my family.'" Women's suffrage leaders around the nation wanted her, to recruit her to be this great leader. She's like, "No, that's not really what I want. I want to just live my simple life." And these newspapermen also talked to a number of the men around Argonia about her being the mayor. And these guys rested on their laurels as, we are the town Argonia that is the first town to ever try the experiment of a woman mayor. Look what we did on purpose. Aren't we progressive? Look at us. Yeah, like you did that on purpose, guys, sure. So, once her term of office expired, Susanna declined to ever run for office again. Her family relocated to Oklahoma, where she lived to the ripe old age of 101. Not bad for someone especially born in the 19th century, right? She did return to Argonia, though, in 1933 to be honored with a bronze memorial plaque mounted on a stone base in the public square. You can see it today. America's first female mayor started as a joke, but she ended as a dignified success. In addition, she also gave birth to her fourth child while in office. So she could take care of business. I like her. Here's a fun little Boston Globe excerpt about her. Susanna Medora Salter is a striking illustration of the possibilities for women in Kansas. She's the wife of a successful lawyer, the mother of 4 lusty children, mayor of the town of Argona, they got that wrong, and only 27 years old. People always giggle at lusty children. So, yeah, I'm pretty sure it doesn't mean the same thing as today. So, I knew the Susanna Salter story. I'd seen it in the books. But what got me thinking about it again was a debate about the $10 bill. And, history can inspire you in different ways. What inspired me to write this, there was a movement to put her on the 10 years ago. Kind of like, they want to put Harriet Tubman on the 20, right? There's been a lot of talk about switching things up. And there was a contingent of people that wanted to put her on the 10. I thought it was a very long shot because she's not a nationally recognized name. She's barely recognized sometimes in Kansas, sadly. But they scrapped this whole idea of changing the $10 bill. Can you guess why? A play called Hamilton. It was so popular. Everyone was like, yeah, that guy's great. Let's keep him. Seriously, they were talking for a long time. They were like, no one cares about Alexander Hamilton. No one even knows who he is anymore. He's dead, whatever. That play came out. All this talk of changing the 10, it's gone. So, sorry, Susanna, you got to wait, and maybe you can get you on the 50 someday. So, my last story is about old-time baseball. Has anyone ever been to a town called Bouchon in Lyon County? Do you guys know the story of the naming of the town? All right. It has to do with old-time baseball and city and state pride. I found this one just by taking a country drive with my son. So I've got a boy. He's not here tonight. He had a stomach ache, but he's 9 years old, and he's in the Scouts. And we love ghost town exploring, fossil hunting. Sometimes we will just get in the car, get out of Overland Park, because, same old thing, and we'll just drive the countryside and explore. So I saw Bouchon on the map and just thought, let's go check it out. And I just loved seeing this little place. And there's still a few people there, but a lot of the town is gone. And I learned it was named after a baseball player. And I was like, you don't see that. You don't see towns named after sports figures, really. And this one ended up being so interesting because it could have only happened in this small window of time. And I'll explain as I go. So I call this story, The Town Named After a World Series Winner. An hour-and-a-half drive west of Kansas City is a tiny, almost ghost town named Bouchon in northern Lyon County. Like many small communities in Kansas, its population has dropped significantly over the years. Empty storefronts dot the old main street, and a derelict school reminds us of a busier past. Originally named Weeks after the local farmer Joseph Weeks donated 20 acres of land to the Missouri Pacific Railroad Company, this community got its start as Kansas was opened up to railroad expansion. The company built its depot on part of this donated land, and Mr. Weeks sold another 20 platted acres as a town. Just like that, a town was born. People were very willing to give land to the railroads for a town back then because having a railroad meant everything. Rewind your mind, guys. It's the 1800s. There's no interstate. There's no airplanes. We don't even have cars. Your railroad is your connection to the outside world. It can get your grain to market. It can get your people, passenger trains out. You do anything to get a railroad. Towns would fight over them. So, of course, Mr. Weeks is going to donate and say, here's my town, Weeks. Free land, Missouri Pacific Railroad. So this town was born because of that. Also, at the same time, in the 1880s, baseball was the uncontested national sport. Think about it, guys. There was nothing else quite like baseball at this time. With the American Association at the time and the National League facing each other in the World Series, they created a National Baseball Championship. This is a precursor to the modern World Series. These were two totally separate leagues that would just have to kind of come to an agreement each year on a championship. It was like AFL, NFL. They were just kind of each their own things. And this was a precursor to a lot of modern teams. There are a few teams that are still around. Cincinnati Red Stockings, we know as the Reds. The Kansas City Cowboys, they're the Pittsburgh Pirates now. But there's some other great teams. The Hartford Dark Blues, the New York Metropolitans, and my favorite old-time baseball team, my favorite, the Brooklyn Bridegrooms. Let's call our team the Bridegrooms. Guys, vote. Cool. That'll strike fear. So the Brooklyn Bridegrooms and all these old-timey teams and lots of guys with great mustaches were all playing each other at this. And it was the first like massive national sport that inspired city pride. When the Royals won the World Series, all of Kansas City was like, hooray. When the Blues won the Stanley Cup recently, all of St. Louis was like, hooray. This really didn't happen before baseball. You know, you don't see anything from the 1830s or George Washington's time where a sport, united a city or a region. Baseball was the first one to kind of do this. There wasn't really any competition yet. There was no NFL. There was no National Hockey League. There was no internet or television, so you don't have to compete with that, right? The Olympics wasn't even back. The modern Olympics was brought back in 1896. So cities prided themselves on the glories of their teams at this time. It was massive. It's hard to really get in your guys' minds how big this was. Baseball was so important. St. Louis residents themselves had immense pride in their local team, the St. Louis Browns. This team later became the Cardinals, not to be confused with the later St. Louis Browns team that existed. The Browns went to the 1885 World Series playing against the Chicago White Stockings, which is now the Cubs. You see how confusing this stuff is? And they had the most hated sports outcome of all, a draw. Each team won 3 games and tied 1 with the World Series ending in dispute. But in 1886, it was a barn-burning season, though, for the Browns, where they posted a 93-46 record and beat the White Stockings 4-2 in the World Series. And you guys are like, okay, Adrian, baseball, World Series, St. Louis. What about this town? How do we get from there to there? The city of St. Louis and the whole state of Missouri were so proud of their team that the Missouri Pacific Railroad decided to honor members of the team by naming some towns along its route after Browns players. This could have only happened right then, when the railroads had uncontested power, when baseball didn't have a rival, and as a nation was expanding. And new towns, names were changing, it wasn't a huge deal. So there's a small window, I think, of about 10 to 20 years where this could have even happened. It would be like the Royals winning the World Series and some powerful railroad being like, all right, Junction City, you're going to be Hosmer. Topeka, you will be Moustakas. And Salvi Perez, you get Dodge City. They could just decide that. You couldn't really go against them. They had that much power. So, the cool thing about this is one of the players, Albert J. Doc Bouchon, one of the exciting players from the team, he got his own town too. There he is on an old tobacco card. Here's a little promotion for that World Series. And here's the rest of the team. I love those hats. I want one. So Bouchon was an exciting player who was an integral part of this team. He played every game that series. He was also teammates with infielder Charles Comiskey, the future founder of the Chicago White Sox, and a guy named Tip O'Neill, whom Canadians refer to as their Babe Ruth. Not to be confused with some politician named Tip O'Neill from the 80s, right? So Comiskey got his own town named after him just a few miles down the tracks, also in Lyon County. But there's no record of what Mr. Bouchon thought about a town being named after him, but you'd have to imagine it was a point of pride for him. This guy played 5 more years and spent the rest of his life as a successful dentist in New Jersey. That's funny, but right? Players, it was like his job. It was just a job. It wasn't like a $1 million contract career. even Vince Lombardi's Packers were like driving cement trucks and selling cars in the off season. This concept of athletes being multimillionaires is such a modern thing. And especially back then, no, you play ball, you get paid per game or whatever, and then you go back to your life. You might go into managing maybe or something. But yeah, I like to think he was pulling a tooth or something over in New Jersey and telling people about his town named after him, and they're probably like, sure, Doc, yeah, there's a town named after you in Kansas. But this town, Bouchon, though, it carried on. At its height, its population was around 150 people. There was a bank, a mechanic shop, a general store, a post office, a hotel, a grade school, and even a high school. Back then, before mechanized farming got advanced like it is now, you needed more people. All these little towns needed more people to work this land, right? So it's shrunk a lot since that time. There's still 15 to 30 people kind of scattered around it, but there's no like real city center with anything going on anymore. So it's kind of a proto-ghost town. So keep in mind, if you drive through the countryside and you come across a forgotten little hamlet, bump in the road, it might have an interesting story behind it. And whatever happened to that railroad, you might ask? This railroad is now part of the Flint Hills Nature Trail, a 117-mile hike and bike trail through the beautiful Flint Hills of Kansas. It was built after the railroad line was discontinued in 1980. So many cycling enthusiasts ride through Bouchon as they cross the 5 counties it encompasses. The name Bouchon survives, though, as a neat reminder of a baseball star from a century and a half ago. So this railroad is gone. The whole reason this town existed is gone. The town is basically gone, and this player is totally forgotten. It's a forgotten player, a forgotten town, a forgotten railroad, but it's so interesting to me. And this state is full of stories like that. And I just came across this doing a Sunday drive. You know, there's so much stuff out there. You could write 50 of these books. The state is full of so much interesting history like that. And if you go out to Bouchon, there's still some cool stuff there. This is a map of the Missouri Pacific Railroad system, and you can see how many towns, like look at that line of towns right along here, especially. See how they hug the railroad? It's really important to be near the railroad for your town to survive. Some of those towns in years before were further away. They picked up and moved the town to be near the railroad. So that's why Bouchon is where it is. Here's a great photo of it from the 19th century. But you go there today, that building's still there, the old bank. It's cool. It's just fun to explore these places. The old bank vault, you can see it in the back. See that brick structure? And the old door, the old vault door is still there with the combination. It's sitting open. My son was like, hey, you think there's money in there still? I don't know, buddy. You could look, but I think someone might have thought of that. The old school, here's a neat picture from the 20s. Look at those old cars out front. The school's still there. I don't recommend going inside. It might collapse on you. But a lot of these places just have so many stories to tell. This is the old Atlas missile silo. Still there today. So a lot of these places just have so many stories. And Bouchon is one of the best ones in the state. I just love its story. So that Flint Hills Nature Trail, that's where you can ride your bike right along Bouchon. And, you know, people just think it's this bump in the road. It's a name, but it's got a World Series story behind it. It's so cool. There's some people riding their bikes along the trail at this modern day. If you ever do ride the trail, Bouchon is left to center a little bit there. It goes from Osawatomie about to Harrington. Has anyone ever ridden the trail? See a couple people saying they've done it. Well, we need to get a historic sign right next to the trail telling about that baseball player. Yeah. So that story about Bouchon is my final story of the night. But I have about 60 stories in this book coming about civil rights, sports, Wild West, a lot of different things because I have a lot of different interests. And Kansas has a lot of different stories of different types. I wrote another book. It's coming out in November called Wicked Kansas. It'll be coming out November 11th. And it's about more of the heels of our state history. There were a lot that I had to leave out of this book because this book would be too many heels. But I thank you for listening to me. And if you're on social media, you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. And I think we're going to have a Q&A portion right now. And if you guys have any questions about any of these stories, about how to do your own historical research, or if you have some hidden history that you want to share yourselves from somewhere you live or something you knew growing up, please share it. Because there is always so many stories that maybe you only know and no one else does. So I really feed off a lot from the crowd and what they have to tell. Yeah, thank you. Okay, we got one over here. Oh, they're going to walk around with a mic.
Yeah, please speak in the microphone
Yeah,
so
we got a
can
mic.
get it on tape. You want to be on tape, don't you?
I came from a little town called Radium, out just straight 12 miles east of Larned.
I'm from Larned, yeah, so my grandpa was born in Radium.
Yeah. that story of Bouchon kind of reminds me of Radium.
Did you go to this old school in Radium?
Yes. Yeah, I
Yeah.
graduated from there. Yeah.
That's pretty great. Yeah, not many people know Radium. I bet it's got a story too. Any other anecdotes or questions about hidden history? Yeah, we got one right here.
What about some of the other baseball players along that route of the railroad?
None of those lasted very long. They all disappeared. Bouchon was the only one. There were a number of other names, but and some in Missouri. But some of these towns lasted 10 years, and then the railroad might bypass their town and they dry up. So Bouchon is the main one that lasted. So, but it's still there. That's the great thing about it. Yeah, another question? Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, he said, what about the other towns named after baseball players? So most of them didn't last, but Bouchon did. So it's still hanging on. There's still some structures there. Still kind of there. Yes, question.
Yes, yesterday, as a matter of fact, I took a trip to Blair, Kansas, which is in the northeastern part of Kansas, and it's not too far from Atchison, but it was where my father was born in 1917. And then the family moved to Alma and then to Harveyville. But I went back to find out where he was born, and there is nothing there but just a few houses. You would miss it almost. And I'm wondering, how do I find information out about Blair? Like, you have pictures and so forth of the old towns. How can I find that?
Well, one of the best resources is right here, Kansas Historical Society. There are so many people here that know so much about different towns, counties, the state's history. Local historical societies is one of your best bets. Any library in that area. A lot of libraries have reading rooms with genealogical research, photos. But I'd say you don't have to do all the legwork yourself. Museums, historical societies, archivists, we need to justify our existence before we're Googled out of relevance. So please, ask us. Hey, do you know anything about the history of, say, you said Alma? Yeah, but I mean, say you lived in Alma later, for example, right? So you say what about the history of the cheese, the Alma cheese? And I'm sure they would know. So county court records is really good. Land records, census records. You can find a lot of that on the National Archives website. But state of Kansas, or the Kansas Historical Society, has a website called kansasmemory.org. It's a great place. They digitize so much stuff. And if you have your phones out, go to kansasmemory.org and open it up. And you can just type in any town, and there's almost something on any county. They have stuff on every county. They have stuff on just about every town in the state. They've done a lot of great work on it. So,
Yeah.
Yep.
The research room is open for the state archives Tuesday through Saturday, 9 to 4:30, just over there.
and if they don't always know the specific answer, they will know who to talk to. They'll say, you need to talk to so-and-so at this society, at the Crawford County Historical Society, or wherever. They're the local expert on that. Call them. They have networks, and they can get you answers.
When I was teaching at Claflin, Kansas in Barton County, I found out that there was a little community just east of town called Kane City. So I went out to look, and it's prairie, but there are dugouts in that. The story is connected with the railroad. The railroad decided not to come through that, so they had to move 2 miles south, and there's nothing that exists there now. But they had to have their depots, so they moved the whole town.
Yeah, you hear about that quite a bit.
Got like 6 people.
Yeah, there's a lot of Central Kansas people here. I grew up at Galatia. You familiar with that?
Hmm?
Okay. Galatia originally was known as Dog Trot. And it was known as Dog Trot because of all the loose dogs that were running around all over the place.
They should have kept that name.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good one.
We had a gentleman over here.
Over here?
Another one. I'm sorry, the gentleman right behind you first. And then you.
I've got a story that ties with 2 villages. One of them is Ellis County, Hayes, as it was, and also Topeka, Kansas. Railroad connecting the 2, very central to both of them. Also the Volga German communities as well, and I'm of the Volga German community. Turns out that there was a lot of transition between Europe, Germany, Russia, and these communities and so forth. And I followed this path over several generations and so forth. And specifically, the one I was most interested in was the deportation in the early 1940s by Stalin. The people who were relatives of the people in Topeka were also, the ones there, were shipped off to Siberia. I interviewed a second cousin of mine who was part of that deportation. He went in when he was 20. And we had a map of the village, and we were able to get details of who lived in what villages. And he was able to give me 50% of the actual what happened to which individual lived in which particular town and so forth. There's a great detail put together in book format there. Okay, that was one piece. Now the other piece was kind of interesting, kind of poetic in some way. One of the sons of Ellis County was a cadet in St. Joe's Military Academy, and he was drafted in the Army, and he ended up serving under, let's see, General, I'm blocking on the name. Anyhow, he was the commanding officer that led the Army across the Rhine River into Germany, which was kind of a poetic justice.
That is pretty good. Yeah, I write a little bit about the Volga Germans in this book and how they got out of Russia at the right time and got to Kansas because they avoided Stalin, they avoided the Russian Revolution, World War II especially, because that was near Stalingrad. Good timing. Yeah.
I was an officer on a destroyer escort in the Korean War in 1952-54 around Korea. I was fascinated when you showed the picture of how to get ready for an atomic attack, because shortly after I got off active duty, the Navy but installed on all the ships in the Pacific Fleet sprinkler systems with the instructions that when you're prepared, an atomic bomb goes off, wait till the first blast goes by, then turn on the sprinkler system. It will wash away all the materials, and then you go about your duty.
That seems like it would work. Wow. That's awesome.
In Cloud County, there was a little town named Toodleville. Have you heard of that one?
Toodleville?
Toodleville.
I don't know if I know that one.
Well, it's now named Miltonville in southeast Cloud County. You would think that had something to do with the railroad, but it did not. It was a Mr. Tootle that donated the land.
But see, we got Toodleville and Dog Trot. Like, we should keep some of these names. I don't know, man.
His comment about the sprinkler system, the Navy called that a washdown system. And every ship had it. And in case of an atomic explosion nearby, They would wash down the ship. They had a crew of about 6 or 8 men who were dressed in an impregnated, grease-filled outfit, and they would go out with brooms and scrub down any hot spots. And then the trick was, were they going to let you back in the ship?
Ooh.
Hi. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your research methods, because there was somebody who was talking about how did you find out about certain things, and I know that there's some research with Marcy Penner and with her partner that they traveled all around Kansas, and every war memorial and every sort of little plaque that you may find in all these little towns, they wrote a book about all of those little anecdotes from each little town. So I was wondering, besides just the Kansas Historical Society, what kinds of other research methods you used?
I rely heavily on the Kansas Historical Society, but also on local county records, Library of Congress, National Archives, and at my job I have access to a lot of stuff, so patent office, things like that. But definitely Kansas Historical Society, more than just about anything. This is the place for Kansas history, and they have so much. But there's some things that I wrote from, that I would base a story off. For example, I wrote a story in here about a ghost town called Ash Valley. It's out by Larned, by my hometown. And there was a place where a railroad went through, and they found a tombstone. This is in the 1920s. They found a tombstone from the 1840s of a man that was shot by and killed by Native Americans. And they found his grave, and they put it in a little monument. And then they continued the railroad. That town is dead now. That railroad is not there anymore. And that monument sits back in some trees. It's like Bashong. It's a forgotten monument next to a forgotten railroad in a forgotten town. It's fascinating. And I just knew about that because traipsing around. So some of this is like boots on the ground research, and some of it is, archival research.
I was going to ask if you could tell us one story that's going to be in your next book, Wicked History.
Oh, something from Wicked.
Your favorite. Not to put you on the spot.
My favorite story from the new book. Give me just a second. I think one of my favorites is the Lowell Lee Andrews story. Are you guys familiar with that story? Yes, so the next book is about con artists, murderers, things like that. Lowell Lee Andrews was a sophomore at KU that killed his family because he wanted to make it look like someone else did it so he could take the family farm and the inheritance and move to Chicago and be a hitman. This was in 1958. He was absolutely delusional. And they found out it was him pretty quick. But the thing is, he shared death row with Hickok and Perry. And Truman Capote writes about him a little bit in Cold Blood. And his story, I find it more bonkers and more unnecessary than the Smith and Hickok and the Cold Blood story. So I tell the story about Lowell Lee Andrews and his background and what might have led him to do what he did. And this happened over in KCK on Thanksgiving night, 1958. But a few of you nodded your heads, and you sound like you do know the story. But that's one of those. It's kind of like it's mentioned a little bit in Cold Blood, but when you go dig into his story, I find it more interesting, actually. And actually, the Menninger Clinic, they were fascinated by this guy. They were confused. They were just like, this guy seems so normal, and he didn't just snap. He planned this, but he was so delusional. He thought he'd get away with it and be a hitman. So a lot of psychology research was done after this guy did this to his family. But it's a sad story, but it's really quite interesting. So that's one of my favorite stories that I researched for the new book. All right. How are we doing on time and questions? Any other questions? I see some over there. and one here.
Hickok and Smith were executed. Was this guy executed too?
He was. He was one of the last 5 people to be hanged by the state of Kansas. So he was hanged in, I think, 1962, and before Hickok and Smith. So we have 5 minutes left?
I think it's 65.
Oh, it was 65 when he was hanged? Yeah, he was hanged before them, though. I know that.
Oh, the other.
Yeah. Well, the Hickok and Smith were 65, but I think Lowell was 62. I don't know, but it was before them. But yeah, he was a extremely delusional character. Really interesting. Any other questions? There was one back up here, I believe. And Lowell Andrews was portrayed in Cold Blood, in Capote, and another movie. Like 3 different actors have portrayed him in films. He's a minor character. Yeah.
I wanted to point out your story about the person who was killed by the Indians and buried by the railroad.
Yeah.
It repeats itself in Victoria, Kansas. They have a little cemetery for the guys who were wiped out by the Indians. They were road builders.
Yeah, and a lot of these stories, they sound about the same. And this guy, 1841, that's a very old tombstone for Kansas. It was a limestone rock. It says, "Here lies D.W. Silver, shot by," and then they scratched in an image of an arrow. They think he might have been a guy that was hunting off the Santa Fe Trail. This had been about 15 miles north of the trail, and he just, had met disaster that day. But no one found it until, there's no record of it. These railroad guys just found the tombstone. How many years later? Almost 80 years later.
Oh, there was somebody else over here. Maybe.
All right. Thank you guys for listening.
Thank you, Adrian. Please stay and visit. I do have 2 comments, maybe 3. Okay, 12. No, we really appreciate you coming to speak. There is still interest in Boston Corbett. We have 2 pieces that belong to him that are currently on exhibit. We have his cartridge belt that he wore when he shot John Wilkes Booth, and we have a mirror. But the other day we were offered to buy a beautifully carved box, wooden box that he made when he was in the insane asylum. And it has an eagle on it. He was very talented, and if you have $8,000 and want to buy it for us, just see me. And the other comment is about the gallows. You may not know, but the Lansing prison is a state, another state office. And so when the death penalty was outlawed at that time, they gave the gallows to the Kansas State Historical Society. So on the behind-the-scenes tour, you can see the trapdoor and everything, and that story. On that cheery note, our next program is August 9th. It is Elevations, a Personal Exploration of the Arkansas River by Dr. Max Mccoy. He's with Emporia State University, and he trekked the 742 miles of the Arkansas or Arkansas River, however you say it. He'll be our next presenter, which is going to be a hard act to follow. Thank you again for coming. Please stay and visit. Thank you.